All right, welcome to seed plants. You're probably most familiar with these types of plants. It includes those that are gymnosperms, which are like the pine trees, and those that are angiosperms, which are flowering plants. Seed plants have several key characteristics which allow them to be the dominant producers on Earth. Seeds actually change the course of plant evolution. Seed plants originated about 360 million years ago. And what a seed is it starts to develop after fertilization of the gametes. A seed contains an embryo, nutrients, and is surrounded by a protective coat. Since the seed is surrounded by a protective coat, it allows it to survive drier conditions and also disperse very, very long distances in several different ways. Now, seeds are one of the key adaptations of seed plants, of course, but pollen is another one. So, pollen can travel very long distances as well. But those aren't the only two key characteristics of those types of plants that have survived for many, many years and are quite widespread. One of them is reduced gametophytes. We kind of talked about that, trend. Now we're getting so reduced that they might be microscopic. All seed plants are heterosporous. And of course, there are structures called the ovules and the pollen, which are the female and the male reproductive organs. Now let's look at the trend again. So we're going to start with the seedless plants. So remember, we have the non-vascular plants. The gametophyte was dominant over the sporophyte. And the sporophyte is actually, it's not dominant. However, it is dependent on the gametophyte for nutrition. So we can see the gametophyte here, it's quite dominant. It's much larger, and the sporophyte is quite reduced. Again, the sporophyte here is dependent on the gametophyte for nutrition. As we move through the seedless still, but vascular plants, the gametophyte becomes reduced, and it's actually independent between the gametophyte and sporophyte, and the sporophyte is dominant. So remember, in the fern, you can see the sporophyte is the dominant structure. The sporophyte again is going to carry the spores, right? So remember, on the fern, the sori, and those are sporangia filled with spores. And then here's the gametophyte. Again, it's so reduced and eventually goes away for fern. Well, when we move to the seed plants, the gametophyte stays reduced, and it's reduced down to, in some cases, microscopic. And it's again dependent. It's dependent on the sporophyte tissue for nutrition. So it's kind of the opposite right here. So here the sporophyte is dependent on the gametophyte in the non-vascular plants. Well, the gametophyte is dependent on the sporophyte. And again, the sporophyte stays dominant. However, it can be extremely large, like the pine trees here. And again, the sporophyte is going to be the entire plant for the flowering plants. So here we can see in the gymnosperms, the gametophytes are basically found inside the cone structures, and we have separate male and female cones typically, and those are referred to as the megagametophytes and the microgametophytes. And the eggs are going to be found in the ovulate cones, and the pollen will be found inside the staminate cones or the male cones. For the angiosperms, these are the flowering plants. Again, everything's microscopic. The gametophytes are going to be inside here. This is inside the ovules right here. So these are the ovules, and then we have the ovary. And then the male, again, is microscopic as well. And these are going to be found on the male parts of the flower. All right, so let's talk about heterospory. So all of these types of plants are heterospores. This should have been introduced in the previous chapter. However, I talk about it more here because it becomes a little bit more important regarding the names. So just to compare homospores with heterospores. So homospores spore production basically occurs in most of the seedless vascular plants, not all, but in most of the seedless vascular plants, a sporangium can be present on a sporophyll, but it can be on its own, and it's going to produce one type of spores. So this makes the plant bisexual in terms of the gametophyte. So the gametophyte can produce both eggs and sperm. Now, um, this is homosporous now, as opposed to heterosporous, all seed plants, and then, of course, some of the seedless vascular plants are heterosporous. So basically, the megasporangium is going to be on a megasporophyll, and mega really refers to all the female parts. And you can see I kind of highlighted it with the pink and blue for the male parts. And microsporangium on the microsporophyll is going to be the male parts. So we have this very large structure, the megasporophyll and the microsporophyll, which are going to contain the megasporangium and microsporangium, respectively. Well, the megasporangium are going to produce the megaspore. The microsporangia are going to produce the microspores, right? So again, these are female and male structures. The megaspore gives rise to the female gametophyte, which is going to produce the eggs. The microspore gives rise to the male gametophyte and produces the sperm. Okay, so you have two totally separate um, hierarchy of structures which produce both the female and the male structures in order to reproduce. Now let's look at the pollen and the production of sperm. Again, the microspore develops into a pollen grain eventually, and this is going to be in the microsporangium on the microsporophyll. And it consists of the male gametophyte enclosed within a pollen wall. So this shows a pine pollen right here. Now the pollen looks different for different types of organisms. Now, pollination is the process of the transfer of pollen from one part of the seed plant to another part of the seed plant, or totally another plant, right? And basically the pollen is going to be the male part, male reproductive structure, and the ovule is going to be the female reproductive structure. So the pollen gets transferred, hopefully, to the part which would lead to the ovule. Now, pollen is kind of important. It eliminates the need for water because they do not have sperm, or they do not have flagella. And the pollen, again, can be dispersed very great distances by air and animals. So here we have the pine pollen. It's almost got wings on it, which allow for mainly dispersal by wind. Now let's talk about the ovules and the production of the eggs. So what happens here is this happens in the ovulate cone. Ovulate cones are, again, part of the megasporophyll, and inside that is going to be the megasporangium and the megaspore. So the megasporangium kind of surrounds the megaspore. You can see the megasporangium is diploid, and the megaspore is, of course, haploid. And then both of those are surrounded by an integument. And all of this kind of protects the egg, which is part of the megaspore. And of course, the egg is also protected by a spore wall. Now, what's ultimately going to happen, and what we're going to be talking about, is pollination. So pollination is basically the process of the transfer of the sperm in the pollen to the egg and the cone. Now, the ovule, again, contains the megasporangium, and then we have the megaspore inside there, which contains the egg. Now, with the integument, there's only one integument in the gymnosperms, and there's two integuments in the angiosperms. And we'll kind of see that when we get to the life cycle of the angiosperms. Eventually, this is going to develop into a seed. So basically, the parts within the female cone, once they're fertilized, right? So once the egg is fertilized, it's going to develop into a seed. And remember what a seed is. It's the embryo with the surrounding nutrients. Now again, this must, basically pollination must occur first. So We saw this already. Pollination ultimately is the transfer of the pollen grain to this ovulate cone or the megasporangium. So once it touches the megasporangium, it's going to generate a chemical reaction, which is going to create a pollen tube. Now, once the pollen tube is complete, the sperm in the pollen is going to be discharged, and then it can lead down the pollen tube and then basically fuse with the egg inside the megaspore where the egg is present. So all of this again is going to be occurring in the megaspore, right? So now it's fertilized. Now we have a embryo starting to develop. Now, as the embryo develops, it gets a lot larger. This seed coat starts to, basically, it's covering this entire structure right here. The spore wall starts to grow. We have the embryo, and then, of course, surrounding the embryo is going to be the food supply. This is a seed, and this is actually an example of a gymnosperm seed. Similar things happen with the angiosperm seeds. Once the seed develops, it provides an advantage. So the seed again is the embryo of the sporophyte, and it contains its food, and then of course it's all protected by that protective coat. Now the advantages of the seeds over spores, as opposed to those organisms or the previous plants that we talked about, they can remain dormant for a very long period of time, from days to years, until the conditions on Earth are favorable for them to germinate. And germination is basically them starting to grow ultimately into a plant. Now, they have a continued supply of food inside them, right? So that's an advantage. It's covered by that protective coat, and within there, the growing embryo has a food source. And then, of course, it can be transported very long distances by wind or animals, and there's several different mechanisms in which that can be done by animals. Seed plants are quite important for humans, not just for their oxygen and the beautiful flowers that some of them produce, but they are key sources of fuel and wood, of course, medicine as well. We kind of rely on seed plants to preserve the diversity of plants. And most of our food comes from angiosperms. Even though they're flowering plants, they also produce fruits and other grains and such that we actually use to eat. So, your textbook kind of cites about this number here, 80% of human calories are come from these following angiosperms. And I think most of these you are pretty familiar with. And of course, we already mentioned wood. Here's a table of basically it's not an exhaustive list, but a list of compounds and their respective source and what they're used for in terms of medicines that come from plants. So some of these you may be familiar with, some of them you may not be familiar with. One I'd like to point out is quinine, which is what used to be used for malaria preventative. However, it's not used anymore because it's quite dangerous. Now, there's an alternative treatment for malaria that's been used for many, many years that is much greater in safety. It's called the hydroxychloroquine, which is actually used these days in some cases, or has been tested for use to prevent the coronavirus. Now, I'm just going to kind of summarize this. I talked about the general characteristics of seed plants. However, we'll talk about some detailed characteristics of specifically and gymnosperms in that segment, and angiosperms and in its segment. We talked about seed development, right? So that involves the process of pollination, and then, of course, the importance of plants.